The wind at Fort Crestline didn't blow so much as it pressed. A flat, dry weight that came off the high desert and laid itself across everything, the equipment, the shoulders of the men standing in formation, the patience of anyone who thought they'd seen everything this base had to offer. Sergeant Major Wynn had been standing on this particular stretch of range for 19 years. And he believed, in the way that men who have been right too many times begin to believe things, that he understood exactly what he was looking at before he even looked at it. He was wrong. She came through the gate at 0614, 12 minutes before the range opened, which meant she had to wait. She sat on the bench outside the equipment bay with her case across her knees and watched the light change over the mountains to the east. Her name was Sienna Rook, and she was a specialist, which in the Army's hierarchy put her somewhere between invisible and inconvenient. She was 29 years old. She had dark circles under her eyes that were permanent, not from fatigue but from the way her face was shaped. She was not large. She was not by any observable measure the kind of person you noticed. Wynn noticed her for exactly one reason. She didn't belong on his precision marksmanship range. The range at Fort Crestline was not a standard qualification range. It had been built in 2019 specifically to train long-range engagement specialists. The kind of people who spent months learning to account for Coriolis effect, for mirage, for the way temperature changes the speed of sound through air, and therefore the behavior of a projectile over 1,000 meters. The men who used this range were carefully selected. They had, in most cases, been shooting since before they could drive. They talked about muzzle velocity the way other people talked about weather. Sienna Rook had been assigned there by a captain who had put her name on the list because he was short on bodies and needed to fill a training cohort. That was it. That was the whole story, as far as Wynn knew it. "Specialist," he said, walking past the bench without slowing down. "You sure you're in the right place?" she said. "Yes, Sergeant Major." He didn't look back. The cohort that morning was 11 men and 1 woman. The men ranged in age from 24 to 38 and included among them 2 prior competition shooters, 1 former hunting guide from Montana who had been making shots beyond 1,000 yards since he was 15, and a staff sergeant named Pruette who had, on one documented occasion, made a confirmed shot at 1,847 meters under field conditions in Afghanistan. Pruette was not a modest man. He was not the kind of man who became modest when a woman sat down in the chair next to him and began assembling her rifle with the calm efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "What's your longest confirmed?" he asked her, the way you'd ask someone their bench press, with that particular tone that contains within it the assumption that whatever the answer is, it won't be impressive. Rook didn't look up from her bolt assembly. "Depends on conditions," she said. "Sure," Pruette said, "but what's the number?" She set the bolt back into the receiver, gave it a quarter turn. 1930, she said, but the wind was cooperative. Pruette smiled. Not meanly exactly, more like a man hearing a joke and deciding to be generous about it. 1,900 meters, he said. And 30, she said. He nodded and turned back to his own rifle. What he was thinking, and what 3 other men in the bay were thinking, and what Wynn was thinking when he reviewed the morning's assignment sheet, was the same thing in different registers. Someone put her here, and that someone was going to have to deal with the consequences when she couldn't perform at distance. The range that morning would run from 300 meters out to 200. That was the opening assessment. Some of the men expected she'd struggle past 600. This is the thing about assumptions that live inside institutions. They become load-bearing. The people who hold them don't always know they're holding them. They experience them not as assumptions, but as professional judgment. Wynn was experienced enough to know the difference, or so he believed. He told himself, watching her walk to the firing line, that he was simply being realistic. She was a specialist. She had been placed here by administrative accident. She had never been through the formal selection process. These were facts, not prejudices. He told himself this while he watched her settle into position with a stillness he had not expected. The first stage was 300 meters. Everyone hit it. This meant nothing. The second stage was 600 meters. Crosswind at 8 miles per hour, gusting to 12. Everyone hit it. This also meant nothing, not really, not at this level. 600 meters in a 10-mile crosswind was the floor, not the ceiling. The third stage was 900 meters. Variable wind. Mirage building off the desert floor in visible waves by mid-morning. Temperature had climbed 11 degrees since they'd started, which changed the air density, which changed everything. 3 men missed on the first shot. All 3 corrected and hit on the second. This was acceptable. Rook hit on the first shot. Pruette, to his credit, noticed. He was in the adjacent lane, and he heard the cadence of her shooting, shot pause, and realized by the third stage that the pauses were not hesitation. They were calculation. She was doing something between shots, running numbers in her head, or working through something, and whatever it was producing results that should not have been possible given what he believed about her. He said nothing. The fourth stage was 1,100 meters with a changing wind. The kind that shifted direction twice in the time a bullet was in flight, requiring the shooter to predict not where the wind was, but where it was going to be. This was the stage that separated the serious shooters from the exceptional ones. You could not muscle your way through it. You could not rely on experience alone. It required a particular kind of mathematical intuition that some people had and some people did not, and that no amount of practice could entirely manufacture if the baseline wasn't there. Wynn walked the line during the prep phase. He paused behind Rook and watched her. She was reading the Mirage through her scope, which was correct. She had a small notebook open near her left knee, a real paper notebook, the kind that had become unusual in an environment where most people used electronic ballistic calculators. And she was writing in it without looking down, her eyes still on the range, her hand moving as if her hand and her brain were different systems running in parallel. He almost asked what she was writing. He didn't. She hit the target at 100 meters on the first shot. The wind shifted mid-flight. Wynn saw the flag downstream change direction, and the bullet still found the plate with a sound that reached them almost a full second after the trigger broke. Pruette heard it. He was still in the setup phase himself, still reading conditions. He heard the hit, registered that it came before he was ready, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not in that moment have vocabulary for. He took his shot 3 seconds later and missed by 8 inches to the left. He corrected and hit. But he had missed first, and she hadn't. They broke for water at 11:30. The temperature was now 91 degrees, and the Mirage was fully developed. The range beyond 700 meters was visually distorted in the heat in a way that made reading conditions harder and made reading people easier, because when you stripped away the comfortable middle distance, you were left with what was close and immediate and true. Pruette refilled his water bottle and stood next to a man named Garrett Cross, who had been watching the morning's shooting with the specific attention of someone taking inventory. Cross was 34, former scout sniper, and was not a person who said things without meaning to. "She's doing something with the notebook," Cross said. "I know," Pruette said. "You know what?" Pruette shook his head. "She said 1930 this morning. I thought she was." He stopped. Cross looked at him sideways. "You thought she was full of it." Pruette didn't answer, which was an answer. "She's doing trajectory modeling in her head," Cross said. "Or something like it. That notebook isn't data entry. It's verification. She works it out in her head first and then writes it down to check herself." Pruette looked at the notebook, which was sitting closed on the bench beside her kit. "How do you know that?" "Because the pause is always before the write, not after. She decides. Then she writes. Then she shoots." Cross took a long drink of water. "I've seen 3 people in my career who could do something like that. None of them were specialists." What Cross was describing and what Pruette was slowly, grudgingly assembling in his mind was a form of applied ballistic mathematics that most trained shooters relied on computers to perform. The variables involved in a long-range shot in variable conditions were, technically speaking, solvable. Atmospheric density, wind speed, and direction at multiple points along the flight path, target distance, projectile coefficient, muzzle velocity, temperature, all of it fed into equations that had been known for decades. The problem was that running those equations in real time, under field conditions, while managing a rifle and reading a scope, was not something the human brain was considered capable of performing with the necessary speed and accuracy. Rook appeared to be performing it anyway. No one had told her she couldn't. The fifth and final stage was 200 meters. This was where the day was supposed to separate itself, where the instructors expected to see the field contract, where the scores would tell the real story. The wind had shifted to a direct crosswind of 14 miles per hour. Mirage was affecting visibility beyond a kilometer. The plate at 200 meters was 8 inches wide. Wynn gave the briefing standing in front of the firing positions. He explained the conditions, explained the standard, explained that one first-round hit at distance qualified a shooter for the next phase of the program. 2 misses eliminated them. He did not look at Rook when he said this. He also did not look away from her fast enough for it to be unnoticeable. She didn't look at him. She was reading the Mirage again, that same distant, parallel processing attention, the one that looked like calm, but was actually something working very fast beneath the surface. Pruette shot first in his lane. He took 45 seconds of prep time, which was thorough without being excessive. He broke the shot and hit the plate. It was by any objective measure a very good shot. He sat up from the rifle and became aware, in his peripheral vision, that Rook had not moved. She was still down, still reading the scope, still in that internal calculation he had been watching all morning without understanding. Her pen moved across the notebook once. She clicked the cap back on. The wind flag at the 800-meter mark shifted 6 degrees. She adjusted the elevation turret by a quarter minute, just a quarter, less than most people would risk. Then she broke the shot. The plate rang at 200 meters, and the sound came back to the firing line a beat later, the way sound always came back from distance, arriving after the fact, confirming something that had already been decided. Wynn was standing behind the line. He had been recording hits and misses on a clipboard for 19 years. He wrote down the hit. He did not write it down any differently than the other hits. But something changed in his posture, a shift so subtle that only Cross, who had been watching people on firing lines for most of his adult life, would have noticed it. It was the posture of a man revising something. The debrief was at 1400 hours in the shade of the equipment bay. Wynn stood in front of the cohort and went through the results lane by lane. He was precise and fair and covered each shooter's performance with the same measured attention. When he got to Rook, he paused half a beat longer than he had paused for anyone else. Specialist Rook, he said. 5 for 5. First round hit at 200 meters under 14-mile crosswind. He looked at the clipboard, then at her. What was your dope at distance? Dope was the term for the precise firing solution. The exact adjustments a shooter dialed in for a given shot. She told him. The elevation, the windage, the fraction she had adjusted when the flag shifted. Wynn wrote it down. Then he looked at it, then he looked at her again. How'd you arrive at the windage correction? Interpolation, she said. The flag at 800 was 14 miles per hour. The flag at 400 was 9. I averaged for the midpoint and projected forward based on the Mirage shift at 100 meters from earlier in the morning. The shift rate suggested a backing wind at altitude, so I cut the surface correction by about 15%. The bay was quiet. Pruette was looking at the ground. What she had just described was a multivariable atmospheric interpolation performed in real time without instrumentation. It was, in principle, something anyone trained in applied ballistics could attempt. In practice, it was something almost no one could execute accurately enough to stake a first-round hit at 200 meters on. Wynn wrote down what she'd said. He wrote it down completely, which was unusual. Normally, debrief notes were brief. This was not brief. Who trained you? He asked. I'm largely self-taught, she said. I spent about 3 years working through the mathematics before I ever picked up a precision rifle. 3 years, the physics interested me first, she said. The shooting came second. Wynn looked at her for a long moment. Not the look he'd given her that morning, not the assessing, quietly dismissive look of a man deciding how much of his time something was worth. A different look. The look of a man who had been measuring against a wrong standard and was beginning to understand the size of the error. I see, he said. He said it quietly, and the 2 words carried more weight than he intended, or maybe exactly as much as he intended, because Wynn was not a man who said things by accident. There is a particular silence that falls in institutional spaces when the implicit order has been visibly disrupted. It is not hostile, exactly. It is the sound of recalibration, of people adjusting the model they carry in their heads to accommodate data that doesn't fit the prior version. The cohort filed out of the bay in ones and twos. Cross walked past Rook on his way out, paused and said, "Good shooting today." Just that, no other context. He kept walking. Pruette was the last to leave, or almost the last. He stopped at the door and turned around. Rook was packing her kit methodically, the same way she did everything, quietly, precisely, without any apparent awareness that the day had meant anything beyond its immediate contents. "I was wrong this morning," he said. She looked up. "Not about anything I said out loud," he clarified. "About what I thought." She studied him for a moment. He was difficult to read. He had the face of a man who was more accustomed to being right than to saying he wasn't. But there was something genuine in it, something that had cost him something to produce. "It's a reasonable assumption," she said. "Given the context." "It's not, actually," he said. "I've been here long enough to know better." She nodded once and went back to her kit. He walked out. Wynn spent 40 minutes after the debrief writing a report. This was not standard practice for a single-day range assessment. The standard practice was a line entry in the training log and a verbal summary to the program director. What he wrote instead was 12 paragraphs, beginning with Rook's performance at each stage and ending with a recommendation that she be evaluated for the Advanced Sniper Curriculum, which was a 12-week program that had, in its 4-year history, produced 29 graduates, all of them men. He read it over twice. He changed 2 words. Then he sent it. He had a feeling about Rook, not the feeling he'd had that morning, which was the feeling of a problem someone had handed him to solve, but a different one, quieter and more fundamental. The feeling that he was watching something early, that the 930-meter shot she'd mentioned that morning, mentioned casually, because to her, it was simply a data point, was not the ceiling. That whatever she was doing with the mathematics and the notebooks and the parallel processing that looked, from the outside, like stillness, was still developing. That she was not finished becoming whatever she was going to be. In 19 years, Wynn had sent exactly 6 recommendations to the Advanced Sniper Curriculum. 3 of those 6 had gone on to distinguished careers. 1 had become an instructor. 1 had washed out in week 4 for reasons unrelated to shooting. He sent the 7th now, and felt, with some precision, the weight of it. The letter came to her bunk at 18:30. It was printed on program letterhead and signed by the curriculum director, a colonel named Deschner, who was known for reviewing candidates personally before accepting them. The letter said she had been recommended, that an evaluation was pending, that she should hold herself available for further contact. She read it twice. She folded it once along the existing crease and set it on her footlocker. Then she opened the notebook, the real one, the working one, not the range notebook, but the one she kept in her left cargo pocket, and turned to a page near the back where she had been working through a problem she'd been thinking about for 6 months. A problem related to angle of attack compensation at extreme elevation differentials. A problem that no one had asked her to solve, and that had no immediate practical application, and that she was working on simply because it interested her. Because the mathematics of where things go when they leave your hands had always interested her, since long before she'd had a reason to care. She picked up her pen. The bunk room was quiet. Outside, the desert was doing what it always did at dusk, releasing the heat slowly, like something reluctant to let go, and the light through the small window turned the page gold for a moment before it faded. She did not think about the letter. She thought about the problem. She wrote,